Big thank you to VJ JavaScript LA for having me. I really appreciate it. How are you guys doing tonight? Good. I think this is Monday Night Football kicks off tonight, and then more importantly, the Bachelor in Paradise season finales tonight, which is what I'm going back to. So I really appreciate the turnout. Thank you guys for coming and hanging out with me. My name is Billy. We'll get into a little bit of that later, but first, I kind of want to get to know you guys a little bit, understand the room, and what your level of experience is. So how many of you guys have any experience with Webpack? A show of hands. Okay, decent amount. How many of you guys, keep the hands up, how many of you guys have experience modifying outside of what Create React app just generates for you? Okay, a little bit more. That's good. How many of you guys are scared of Webpack? Yeah. Anybody have a background in like Gulp or Grunt, anything like that? Yep. Anybody hesitant to kind of move to Webpack because they like Gulp or Grunt? Maybe? Okay. Cool. So tonight we are going to be talking a lot about Webpack, specifically Webpack 4 and code splitting. So this is something that I actually kind of recently stumbled into. I am a lot like you. I kind of avoided Webpack at all costs. It scared me. I have a background in JavaScript, and I used Gulp for years, and I enjoyed it. And then Webpack came along, and I slowly kind of made the transition, but tried to avoid it. What's this configuration file? Why does it kind of feel like I'm not doing anything, but just sort of passing it into the ether, and then stuff magically happens, but I can't really see it happening? Scared me at first. So the last job I took, I got thrown into the deep end with Webpack, and I was forced to figure it out from the ground up, specifically Webpack 4. And I learned that while the documentation is really good, there's also kind of a lot of assumptions that are being made and a lot of holes in the documentation. And Webpack 4 is actually kind of new, which we'll learn about in a little bit. But a lot of the community and a lot of the resources that are out there are going to help you with Webpack 1, 2, and 3. But there aren't too many out there for 4. So once I kind of got all this figured out, I figured why not come and share a little bit about that. So tonight I am assuming, I should probably start presenting. There we go. Much nicer. Tonight I assume you probably have one of 4 questions. What is Webpack? Why Webpack? How do I use Webpack? And then the most important question, which all of you are asking, is are there any resources online that I can get at the end of this talk? Or something along those lines. Before we dive in, I want to share a little bit about myself. The first thing you need to know about me is that my real name is way cooler than I actually am as a person. I'm pretty boring. I spend most of my time, get this, I actually got married 3 weeks ago to the most beautiful woman who's also my best friend. We spent the first 3 weeks of marriage helping me get over a triple sinus infection and a triple ear infection and sinus infection. I'm still kind of recovering from that, so if my voice kind of wavers or cracks at any moment, please forgive me. She's been very gracious. Any of you guys married out there? Show of hands. Oh, wonderful. I'm gonna need anyone married for more than 3 weeks? Great. You sir in the back in the red. What's your name? Tom. I'm gonna need some advice because I got 1 week left to salvage the first month, and I need some help. So. Okay, maybe not. Maybe any other takers? I'd love to get some marital advice because the first 3 weeks have not gone that well because I've been really sick, and then I prepared for tonight. My wife and I have a beautiful little girl. Her name is Marceline. She is our everything, and from time to time I turn her into a cartoon. And so every year on my wife's birthday, I make a book about the year that we celebrated with one another, and I tell it from the perspective of our dog, and then I have an illustrator turn our dog into a cartoon. So I'm currently in the process of doing that right now, but that's our dog as a cartoon. Over the last 5 years, I've worked at a handful of these companies. Writing software, I've taught for a couple of years, so kind of exciting to get back up and do a little bit of teaching tonight. But there's a camp down the road called Redwood, and then I've actually done a little bit here, and hopefully a little bit more in the future. And in a past life, I used to play music professionally. So any musicians out there? No? One? What'd you play? Guitar? Nice. What kind? Yeah. Okay. I saw another hand in the back. What do you play? All right. I've seen a lot of correlation between music and coding, and so I'm always interested to kind of meet other musicians that have sort of made that transition themselves. So, yeah, I used to do that for a number of years. So, all right. So, what is Webpack? What is code splitting? Why are we all here tonight? So, Webpack was initially released about 6 years ago. I think March 10th, 2012, to be a little bit more specific. But like I mentioned earlier, Webpack v4 came out February 25th. February 25th, earlier this year. So it's really only 6 months old, maybe 7 months old. Pretty new. Webpack 1, 2, and 3 kind of built off the backs of one another. But Webpack 4 was a complete rewrite from the ground up. So a lot of the plugins and a lot of the things that kind of worked and kind of graduated from one to the next, none of them really worked when you moved to 4. Again, so that's kind of why I'm talking tonight, because a lot of the community resources are still kind of catching up. So Webpack 4 kind of feels like a brand new car. With that, it's actually it's a lot faster, it's a lot more performant, and it does a lot of cool things. What they say is everything is a plugin, and if you've spent time with Webpack, you kind of understand what that means. It's got over 40,000 stars on GitHub. Over 230,000 lines were written by this gentleman, Tobias Kopers, but it is an open source project, so it's got over 450 different people contributing to it at the moment. If you're online, there's kind of a guy named by the name of Sean Larkin, who's a little bit more of like their spokesperson. Highly recommend his content if you're interested in getting more into Webpack. Again, his name is Sean Larkin. I think you can follow him on Twitter at the Larkin or something like that. Great guy. He's like a project manager over at Microsoft, and he's doing a lot of really cool stuff over there, helping Webpack kind of move into new territory. So even though Tobias is kind of one of the main authors, he's in Germany. Sean's over here, and he's doing a lot of cool stuff with the tool. And then Webpack is an open source JavaScript module bundler, which, does anybody know what that means? Anybody want to take a crack at that? Nice. That makes this next slide a little bit easier. What's a module bundler? It basically builds your dependency tree. So if you were just building a static website, you're probably really familiar with either like a link tag in the top or script tags in the bottom. And if you're building a really complex application or a really complex site, you're probably used to, at this point, having to kind of order those link tags or script tags in a very specific order. You want to have the thing that is the most important maybe be loaded first, and then the thing that is dependent upon everything else to be loaded maybe more towards the bottom. The job of a module bundler is to build a graph or to build a tree. Its job is to kind of go through your files and sniff this stuff out to understand what's dependent upon what. And once it understands that, it builds this tree or this graph, and it understands the relationship between one file and the other. You've probably seen import statements at the top and maybe export statements at the bottom. Those statements are how the module bundler does this. So it builds this tree, it builds this graph. And then the next thing it does is it creates static assets, or it flattens those files. Sometimes it will minify them or uglify them or concatenate them into one file. Tonight we're going to be talking about how to not concatenate them into one massive file, but maybe split them out into several files. But its job is to understand these relationships and then create static flat assets. So we can use things like ES6 or TypeScript or Sass or all of these sort of languages that are built off of languages that we already know, but the browser just isn't quite there yet, right? The other really cool thing about this module bundler in particular is it's JavaScript specific. Yes, there are plugins, and we won't get into too many of them tonight, but there are plugins to help you with HTML and CSS. But the beauty of it being just a module, a JavaScript module bundler, that's a tongue twister, is that you can use it for any JavaScript application. So if you're writing in AngularJS or Angular or React or Vue or even Node, you can use this to kind of help you accomplish whatever you would like to accomplish. So the team that I'm currently working with is actually using Webpack to compile the, Sean, help me out here. Compile the assets, do all of the things. I have a plant in the audience. He's right there, red shirt. So if he asks a silly question, just ignore him. They're using it on the back end. So it's been really cool. I haven't actually had a chance to kind of see how they're using it and what they're doing with it, but I know it's allowed them to use a lot of the new cool ES6 TypeScript kind of stuff that makes coding a heck of a lot easier in their Node project. And so they've really enjoyed Webpack specifically on the back end. So I'm excited to dive into a little bit more of that myself. And then what is code splitting? Anybody have any idea what code splitting is? Yeah.
It's the ability to split up your code pretty much so that we can do things like lazy loading or not pull down that full large file all at one time and slow down your.
You want to come up and finish this off? Tag you in? Exactly. So it's the process of basically turning our code into like little bite-sized chunks, right? So there's a lot of JavaScript code. All of these frameworks kind of are getting bloated, and there's a lot to them. And so applications, and specifically applications that we maybe want to run on the phone, there's a lot to download into those applications. So code splitting kind of came around as a way to break these things into smaller bite-sized chunks so that we only load what we need when we need it. And so that's kind of the process of code splitting. There's another thing called tree shaking. I almost said tree splitting. Anybody know what tree shaking is? Sean? Don't look it up.
Is where we go through the dependencies and see if it already exists. And if it already exists, we don't download it again.
Yep.
If we need it, we grab it. If not, we leave it alone.
Yep. And sometimes, believe it or not, you will import something and then you won't use it. And so Webpack actually does tree shaking just right out of the box. If you import something at the top of a file and you don't ever use that variable, hopefully you're using a linter, but if the linter doesn't catch it or you're not using one, tree shaking will just completely eliminate it. It won't even waste the time importing that thing for that specific file. So tree shaking kind of comes out of the box for Webpack. Code splitting, there's a little bit more work involved with it, but it's the process of kind of breaking things into smaller chunks. There's actually two styles of code splitting, and this was the thing that really confused me the first time I was going at it, because I'd read one tutorial and I'd think I'd kind of understand, but it was taking me this way. And then I'd read another tutorial and I'd think I'd really understand, but it was taking me this way. And then I had these like two disparate understandings of like how to do code splitting, and then I realized, wait, they're not competing with each other. You can do them in tandem with one another. So what are they? I can code split my code versus vendor code. And vendor code is often, anybody know what vendor code is? Yeah, NPM, right? Anything you download from a third party. So any vendor code, for whatever reason, I'm big with semantics and words. Vendor really confused me. It basically means any other code that you downloaded from NPM or Yarn or whatever you're using, right? That's vendor code. The other way you can do code splitting is you can chunk up your code into smaller bite-sized chunks. And I'm going to show you how to do both of those tonight with what we're doing. So again, we can kind of separate my code versus the vendor code, and that's actually really helpful because we can utilize caching in the browser. That'll really help you out. And then let's say your website has, I don't know, 20 different pages. I think the website we're building right now is maybe got like 15 or something like that. I can make a chunk for every single route or every single page. And if the user, in the course of using the app, only goes to 3 of those pages, well, they're only going to load the code necessary for those 3 pages, and we're going to ignore the other 12. We don't need to download those to the phone or the device or whatever if we don't have to. So the old-fashioned way is load everything in the beginning, and then that causes load times, and then your boss is mad at you, and SEO team is mad at you, and everybody's mad at you, and then you quit your job because you're mad at you. And I haven't worked there. You worked there. Why should we learn Webpack? So I like stories. Hopefully you like stories. If you want, you can gather around, a little half circle in the front. But back in February, I had an opportunity to work at a company. I will leave them nameless, although if you ask me, I will tell you. And in the interview, they said, we're working with a lot of legacy code. We need to be kind of bringing things into the 21st century. And I said, I'm your guy. That was a mistake, but I got the job. So I go to work for this company. They're using a lot of legacy code. Everything was breaking left and right. Once I got into the code and I started looking at it, it was a little terrifying. I'm not going to lie. So they were running Angular 1.3. They were using AMD and require syntax to kind of help build their tree. They were using something called Steel.js, which I had never heard of before. Its job was to kind of help build the tree as well. They had a gulp file, they had a grunt file, they were using Bower and NPM, both of them were breaking. We were using Browserify in some areas and Browser Sync in other areas, and it was a complete mess. And so I cried a little bit, and then I decided to dive into Webpack. So this was the project that kind of forced me to look deep into what's going on with the new V4, Webpack V4 at the time was maybe like 3 or 4 weeks old. And so I really had to dive into the documentation and harness the early community to figure things out. But we consolidated things into these 3 beautiful things. The reason why I don't work there anymore is because we weren't able to turn this into React. But I lost that battle, so it's okay. I'm in a much better spot. Don't worry about it. But yeah, we were able to consolidate all of those old tools and just use Webpack to do everything that all of those tools were doing. So why Webpack? Because it's powerful. It can do an enormous amount of things in one tiny little configuration file. I'm an advocate for Yarn. I don't know if anyone use Yarn out there. Anyone still using NPM? Should check out Yarn. I'll talk about that next time.
Why Yarn over NPM 4?
It's faster. It's a heck of a lot faster. It does like caching. So that if your first download is like a minute, your second download's gonna be like less than 3 seconds. It's amazing. So other reasons, you can do all of these things, right? It doesn't matter. It's any JavaScript project you're working on, you can use Webpack to help you in some way, shape, or form. If all you want to do is use TypeScript, right? And you just want to use the Babel loader to help TypeScript be transpiled into vanilla JavaScript for whether it be your Node project or your React project or your Vue project. Doesn't matter. You can use this to do it. So it's versatile. You can do a lot of different things. The other big thing, and I'm a little hesitant to say this one because I hate the reasons like, well, why should we do it? Well, everyone else is doing it. But everyone else is doing it. So unfortunately, we live in a world where we all kind of depend on each other. And the community is a really big thing. So if we're thinking about compilers or bundlers or anything like that, here's kind of your 3 options. And it's pretty obvious who's winning the race at the moment. And so why Webpack? Well, there's a really big community with Webpack. And if you're like me, you're probably on Stack Overflow multiple times a day, copying and pasting this Frankenstein of a thing to get it across the finish line because your PM didn't estimate things very well. I didn't work there, you worked there. Code splitting. So why code splitting? Smaller packages to download. I kind of already talked about that. Only load what you need it. Kind of already talked about that a little bit. The advantage of caching, so we're going to talk about this a little bit later. But that big vendor chunk, all those NPM modules that you do, chances are per project, you're not going to be adding a new module anytime soon. Usually, if you're like most projects, that package.json file is probably going to change and morph and grow quite a bit in the early stages. But after V1, you're probably not going to add too many packages to it. So once you get that locked in, we can turn that into one chunk, load it into the client, and cache it there, and save it there. And so every single time you go back to the page, you're not loading what you'll see later. It's about 90% of the code you load. You don't ever have to load that anymore. You can just load the code that you need to run your application. So that's huge. And then think mobile. Everyone, usually you're probably developing, all of you, on a desktop or a laptop, and so things load really quick. If you don't already use it, there's like a little, in the network tab, I think you can throttle in like 3G mode. I recommend that you throttle into 3G mode every now and again. Because you might be like, oh, everything's loading super quick. This is awesome. I'm so good. And then you throttle in 3G mode and you're like, I don't know what I'm doing, right? Like throttle into 3G mode with whatever project you're working on tomorrow, and you might want to rethink about some code splitting stuff because things load really slow. And we've all had that app, right? You're trying to, never mind. All right, so this is the fun part. We're going to break into some code. Spoiler alert, I'm going to give all this code away at the very end of this. So if you want to code along or follow along, by all means, do it. I'm not really going to go at a pace that's probably followable. But if you have questions, also I'm completely interruptible. So you have questions, you want me to go back a page, shoot your hand up, yell at me, whatever you want. But we're going to dive into some code and see how this thing is done. So once we install Webpack, what do we do? So I've got a little React project here. Sorry if you don't do React. Probably should have put that in the title. Oh well. Make it a little bit bigger. That's kind of tiny, right? Yeah, oh, very tiny.
Maybe a lot bigger.
A lot bigger. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. A little better? Maybe?
2 more.
2 more? 1, 2.
Thanks.
Yeah? Okay. All right, so I got a really stripped down simple project. It's designed to help you to, I've pre-built everything. So it's 3 pages, it's really boring, but I want you to see the 3 different routes and kind of how it works. I am utilizing, we can do it kind of normally, but I'm utilizing a package called React Loadable. Has anybody ever heard of that one? No, oh, one person, awesome. So I have a very simple application, right? Over here I have my source folder, and in here I have 5 components, and then I have a routers folder with one route, okay? And then in my app.js, I'm loading React DOM. I'm loading my router, which is kind of my application, more or less, and then I'm rendering that to the page. Everybody good? Everybody following? Okay. Let's look at the app router real quick. We might want to zoom out a tiny bit here. So I kind of want to skip over these lines for the time being, because this is some of the magic sauce. And I want to go down here. So I'm building my router. This should all kind of look relatively familiar if you know React. Everybody, more or less, how are we doing? Okay. So I've got 3 routes, right? So I've got my root route, which is just going to load my async home component. I've got my hello, which is going to load my hello world component. And I've got my goodbye, which is going to be my goodnight moon component, right? So I've got 3 routes, 3 components. There's nothing fancy about these components. You'll see here in just a second. Actually, I can kind of toggle over. Actually, I already have it up. So here's this fancy application that I built. Very simple, right? 3 simple pages, nothing crazy. So we don't have to dive into that code at all. I've got a nav bar, I've got a footer. They're boring. Let's go back to this. Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm loading in React Loadable. And then what you're able to do with Loadable is you're able to dynamically import. So there's a couple different ways. You probably, if you've done any work with this, you can do, the other way to do it is you can say something like import. And in here, I can kind of do my string, right? So I can say, go back a path, go into components, and get home. And what this will do is it returns a promise. So I can tack a .then on there and handle that. What React Loadable does is it basically kind of wraps this up in a really nice way. So I don't have to do that. There's another way to do it, which is like require.ensure. It's sort of out of style. People are moving away from that. Browsers are no longer supporting it. But more or less what React Loadable is doing is it's sort of just doing this. So we can do our normal import statements up at the top, which you're probably familiar with if you've looked at ES6 code. But you can also do it like this, where you call import like a function. You tell it what path you want to import, and then you can return, it returns a promise, and you can handle that promise later. Okay? So Loadable takes in an object, and I'm saying I want to load this component. And when it's loading, so there's kind of like a loading state. Depending on your app, you might want to kind of create like a loading page or a landing page or a spinner, something like that. Right now, I'm just rendering a div. And I think if you remember, some of you might have caught it when I went back to that page and I hit refresh really quickly, it said it flashed loading. It rarely will do that, but if you are in the 3G kind of scenario, you probably will see loading. So whatever that loading page is, what I typically will do is I'll kick off just kind of like a really thin like loading bar at the top here, but for the demonstration's sake, I just am loading a simple little page, okay? So I have each of these. So these will only be called, so here's async home, async hello world, and async goodnight moon. And then in my router, I'm loading those components. So these things will only be called when the routes are specifically hit. And what that ends up kind of looking like, if we go back to our page, if I come, oops, not ready for you yet. If I come back here, everybody see the bottom? It's kind of tiny, isn't it? That's better. Everyone see that? Oops. Okay, I'm on the home route. You can see a couple of things loaded, and we'll talk about the other ones first. We have main bundle.js, manifest, and vendor. We'll talk about those in a second. But the one I want you to focus on is 0-point bundle.js. So if I were to go to hello, I get 1-point bundle.js. That's the hello page loading. And if I go goodbye, there's 2-point bundle.js. So it's lazily loading those pages or those routes because I've chunked them up. The really cool thing about React Loadable is you can chunk up whatever you want. So if you're on a page and, I don't know, maybe there's a feature or a functionality where you pop a modal and that modal brings in like a Google map and people can kind of like dynamically pick where they live or where they want pizza delivered or something like that. There's a lot to that. That modal is going to cost you some time. The Google map thing is going to cost you some time. And maybe after some analytics, you realize only 5% of users actually pop that modal and use that feature. Well, you can do that, you can load that specific component using React Loadable and sort of isolate it. So when they go to the page for the first time, they're not loading it, and when they pop the modal, it loads dynamically. So you can get really crazy with this and chunk things up really tiny. You end up getting an enormous amount of files. Things get a little bit messy. It's sort of up to you, but what I would say is starting at the router level is a great place to start, because not everyone's going to go to every single page. And then if you get some really good analytics into your application, you can then kind of start chunking things up from there when you start to realize that, oh, only half my users actually use this one feature on this page, or scroll down to see this thing that I built, right? So yeah. The other part is built right into how we do the Webpack config file itself. So I'm going to zoom this out a tiny little bit. There's a couple things going on here. So if you've played with Webpack before, you know that it needs to return an object. And so the way I build Webpack, some people out there will do like, they'll have webpack.prod.config.js, and they'll have webpack.testing.config.js, and then they have this Webpack merger, and so they have all these different files, and they merge them all together, whatever. I just return a function. And this has been a heck of a lot easier for me. So what I end up doing is I module that exports a function that takes in an argument. And if you go to my package JSON, you can see that I'm passing in --env development. So development ends up getting passed into that function. So I know which environment I'm running it in. Am I in a testing scenario, a development scenario, a production scenario? And so I use that function to kind of build my object and then return the object at the end. For me, this feels a heck of a lot cleaner than kind of having 5 different files that kind of get merged together. Some people like those different files. Doesn't matter. Do what you like, but this is what I'm doing. So I'm passing in whether it's development or production, and then I'm asking the question, is this a true statement or a false statement? Is production, is development, right? Clean plugin, I'm not going to spend too much time on any of these. Clean plugin, basically every single time I'd run a build, it creates a dist folder. So what clean will do is it'll remove the dist folder for me. So I just start with a fresh copy every single time. Analyzer, we're actually going to spend a little bit of time with this. It creates a page, which popped up for a second if you caught it. But it creates a page, and we'll kind of dive into that page and look at it. This thing's really cool. It's also really annoying. So all you need to know is that you can toggle this to none if you're over it, and it won't annoy you anymore, okay? It's kind of annoying at first, though. HTML plugin is really helpful. If you don't have this, none of this will work. So what you need is, I kind of have a template HTML page, which has just got some very basic stuff on it. And then what I'll do in the Webpack config is I'll say, go ahead and copy template.html. I'm going to be honest, I don't remember what this line does. But what it'll do is, because there are a bunch of chunks being made, it'll dynamically import all of those script tags or even some of the link tags for you. So if you don't have this one piece, the whole thing falls apart. I learned that the hard way. Entry point, output, we're going to kind of skip over these. So here's some of the magic. So split chunks, cache groups, vendor. What the heck is vendor? When you're reading documentation, it doesn't really explain it. Does anybody remember what vendor means? NPM. Just remember vendor, NPM. So all of my vendor code I want to get chunked into one initial block. And so they will all become one big group. Again, that will get loaded onto the front end one time. If I ever make a future update to, let's say, okay, V2 of my application is coming out, we did add a couple of packages. Next time you build all of your chunks, the script tag will be different. The file will be different. So it will kick out the old file and it will load the new file. But if it recognizes that it already has the file, it's going to just forever cache it locally in your client. So that's super helpful. And I'll get to that in just a minute. Runtime chunk, manifest. This one was also a little confusing. The way that I understand manifest is that, like, I have my routes. So I have my application and I have my routes. And usually when you go to the application, it's going to load the home route almost immediately, right? But there's all of the other stuff that kind of goes into the application. So like my app config file, my router file, all of the necessary stuff to just kind of get my app bootstrapped and started, that's going to be the manifest chunk. So I've got the vendor chunk, which is someone else. I've got the manifest chunk, which is just the bare minimum to get the app up and running. And then I've got everything else chunked into routes. Okay? And then down here all the way at the bottom, I have the if I'm in production mode, I want to build things a very specific way. And if I'm in development mode, I want to build them a separate way. So the big difference here is going to be this chunk hash. You'll see it up here is different than down here. That chunk hash represents the code that is actually being hashed. So if the code itself changes in any way, shape, or form, that chunk hash will be a different hash. So again, with the vendors, if you're not adding NPM packages all day, every day, that chunk hash is pretty much never going to change, which means you can get the benefits of that being cached locally in your client. But maybe your route will change here or there. Maybe your manifest file will change here or there, that initial startup code. And so those will change, but as you'll see here in a second, they're really not that big, okay? Any questions? I just went over a lot. Yeah. Yeah, so the output part of Webpack is basically saying like I have an entry point up here all the way up here at the top. So Babel polyfill basically just means that like not everything's going to work in every browser. So the polyfills are going to help kind of smooth that out. But then I'm saying my entry point for my application is app.js. And then the output point is where I want all of my code to go. And you can specify how you want your code to show up in the output or the dist folder, which we'll see here in a second.
Using the chunk caches to bust the cache.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. All right, so let's see some of this stuff in action. So if I come back over here, this isn't big enough. Is that big enough? Okay. If I say yarn run build prod, just my scripts, you can see your Webpack environment production. I had that console log in my thing. So, all right, so this is that analyzer. See how annoying that is? It just like takes you straight to it. So when you're trying to do some analysis, awesome, this thing's amazing. But when you're just like in Webpack dev server and every time you save, it does a hot reload, and every time you do a hot reload, it just takes you to this page, it's really, really annoying. So don't forget to turn it to none because you want to turn this thing off. But this is my application. So this whole tannish gray thing is the vendor chunk. And this little blue sliver is my application. This is the code that I wrote. And it doesn't matter how much code you write, these proportions really don't ever change. So your vendor chunks are going to always be way bigger than whatever your application is, right? So if I can, and you can see here, this right here, this string of characters, that's the chunk hash. So if I were to run this again, which I will, so E1, E8, right? We didn't download a new NPM package, but if I were, it would change. But if we don't download a new NPM package between now and version 2, it's the same thing, E1, E8. So that hash will always stay the same if I don't update that information. Again, that gets loaded the very first time my user goes to my application. It gets stored in a local cache, and I don't ever have to worry about it ever again. Then all they're ever loading is this little stuff. That's awesome, right? So if we zoom in here, or not, jeez. How do we do this? Okay. So this is my main, which is basically the manifest. There we go. So this is the basic information, right? My app router, navbar, footer, right? Those weren't locked away inside a specific route. And if I scroll down here a little bit, I've got page 1, page 2, and page 3. So here's chunk 1, chunk 2, and chunk 3. So when we went to every single page, you saw them load dynamically. So some of your pages might be a little bit bigger than others, but as you get more pages, this will get bigger and bigger and bigger. So thoughts, concerns, questions? Did I lose anybody? All right. So the real question. Where can I get my hands on this, right? A couple of resources. I went ahead and threw this entire project up on my personal GitHub. If you have a pen and paper, by all means, copy this down right now. Webpack's website is obviously a great place to go. Their documentation is actually really good. I know I kind of gave it a hard time in the beginning. There's just a couple of moments, specifically with code splitting, where they make a lot of assumptions. And if you aren't up with it, or you doze off for a half a second while you're reading the docs, you might miss something. So, but the documentation is really, really, really good. So I would recommend you start there. React Loadable, that's the GitHub for the thing that I used. And then Survive.js/Webpack, highly recommend that. Every single time I ran into a problem, I would run across these guys. And they've kind of written a book. I strongly recommend, if you're getting into Webpack, read that book. It was hands down the keys to the kingdom of unlocking any question I had with Webpack was inside of that book. And they've got a lot of really good resources. Website may throw you off when you first see it. It's not the prettiest thing on the planet, but holy cow, the contents are phenomenal. So literally every single time, I just kept kind of, as you do, like running into a wall, and I kept noticing every single time I kind of broke through that next wall, it was because of those guys. So highly recommend you go to that if you're looking to learn more. Whew. I think I'm going to make it in time for Bachelor in Paradise. It's a good night. That's all my wife cares about. I was like, hey, I'm talking tonight. She's like, are you going to be home on time? I was like, oh, I don't know.
That's the most important thing you can do right
It
now.
is, yeah. That is, so, advice, hit me.
Question. So
Okay.
how you handling your SaaS stuff?
SAS, I intentionally left that out. Thank you for asking. No, I do have another, if you go to my GitHub, I have another project, both front end and back end. It's called Bands in Town, and it handles all the SaaS stuff in there too. So there's a number of other plugins that you need to do. Again, radically different from 3 to 4, but the Bands in Town example kind of covers that. He mentioned it in the beginning that JavaScript LA has a Discord channel. If you're not already in the Discord channel, it's amazing. I highly recommend that you join. I'm in the Discord channel, and so if you want to exchange information at the end, I'm more than happy to kind of connect, and I can share those resources with you. But you can find me in that channel as well. Yeah.
So I'm working on a nasty monolithic legacy app,
Ooh.
and would like to start using Webpack.
Okay.
Is there a way to maybe just target the CSS less SAS stuff separately and have a different web config for the JavaScript part?
Possible. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
typically they're all in one Webpack config.
Yeah. Yeah. I would. I mean, after going through everything that I went through again with that story I told, using all these kind of disparate tools, once I realized Webpack could kind of do all of it for me, it was a no-brainer to kind of swap over. But I understand monolithic applications are, and sometimes the boss isn't really.
We just kind of want to ease into it. And
Yeah.
It's like all the style sheet stuff is the lowest risk and it's simple.
Yeah, if you want to do, I mean, I've had a lot of luck with it. So the designers that we work with, they basically will write all the HTML and the SAS for us, and I just take their SAS and I drop it, and it just works. So with the configuration, again, I kind of omitted it because it muddies the water a little bit. But again, on that GitHub page, you can find another project of mine where I have both working in conjunction. So you can probably kind of strip out the JavaScript stuff and just use it for CSS or SAS, and it works great. So they have different loaders, is what they call them. So you have like a SAS loader and a CSS loader, and then you're probably most likely, if you're doing CSS or SAS, you're also sometimes loading like dynamic images from here and there in your CSS. So you need like a file loader as well. You'll see examples of all three of those in some of the other applications I have on my GitHub. Yeah.
You got time to go over some of the actual code splitting in the config and like maybe line by line kind of what each item is. I've used it in 3 and a little bit in 4, and I know 4 kind of automatically does the vendor your code split automatically, I think, from what I understand. But then maybe talk about how you could split your own code a little bit more.
Kinda. Let's sync up after this, so we can kind of dive a little bit more into detail. But any other questions? Yeah.
Is there a good way of being able to split up your vendor bundle if you wanted to, let's say you
Ooh.
have application?
For server-side rendering?
Yeah.
Yeah. Some people try. Yeah, some people try. I think there is a way to go about it. It's a lot of new territory in a lot of ways because V4 is 6 months old. So I didn't see any tutorials myself that I was like super confident that I was gonna get luck with. But yeah, that is it kind of becomes apparent when you see that analyzer. It's like, well, that's what I want to cut up, right? But once you load it once, you should in theory really never have to load it again. But yeah, it would be nice to cut that up. So good question. Yeah.
Did this emerge to solve the problem, or was it more popularity? Gulp and grunt and browserify, do they not do some of the things well that Webpack does?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure why Webpack came around, to be honest, or like what was the. I mean, every week we're getting introduced to a new JavaScript library somewhere, some tool that we didn't ask for that solves some problem that we didn't know existed, right? So every now and again you find a diamond in the rough, and I think Webpack was that more or less. But yeah, I don't know. I certainly was able to do a lot of this stuff with Gulp, but there was the tree building was a little bit difficult, and I think that's sort of the key with Webpack. Even in Gulp, I had to still kind of specify this file gets loaded first, this one second, this one third, and if you've got some of these bigger applications, sometimes, especially with React, you're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of files. You don't want to be the one managing how they relate with each other, and so the fact that Webpack handles that for you, understands those relationships, and builds based on them, you can't. I would never want to do Gulp with React. But when I did AngularJS back in the day, it was manageable. So that's a good question. Anyone else? That's it. Thank you so much. I'm going to hang out here up front for a little bit. By all means, I think they have pizza and drinks, and there's a bathroom downstairs. Hang around. Networking is a big part of meetups, so meet the people around you. I know some of you guys might be looking for jobs. You might be looking to hire someone at your work. But get to know each other. That's the best part about these things.